Hillary Rodham Clinton is the only First Lady in history to become a U.S. Senator. Next, historian Blanche Wiesen-Cook discusses her biography of another First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Her remarks on the second volume in her series are about an hour, 15 minutes.
Everybody, I'd like to welcome you to the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. My name is Doug Coulard, and I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Manhattan Sites. For those of you who haven't been to the site before, when you hear the term Manhattan Sites, it gets confusing, but what it is, we have 6 historic sites, all operated as basically one large national park here in Manhattan, as opposed to Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, which is a separate park, and Gateway, which is a separate park. So in Manhattan Sites, we have Castle Clinton National Monument, Battery Park, Federal Hall and Wall Street, Theodore Roosevelt birthplace, Hamilton Grange, Alexander Hamilton's home, 130th, the infamous Grant's tomb, and St. Paul Grant's tomb, and St. Paul's Church of Mount Vernon. So those are our 6 sites, and they represent history all the way from the Revolutionary War all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt and his Battle of San Juan Hill. So we have a remarkable array of resources, historic resources in our city. And I think my favorite is Teddy Roosevelt's. And today you're all here for one reason, to hear our author, our renowned author, Blanche Cook, and talking about her new book, second volume of Eleanor Roosevelt. Not Theodore, Eleanor. she may refer to Theodore, but I think it's... Anyway, welcome again to the site. After the tour is over, after the talk is over, if anyone is interested, we will be taking tours of the site. And our rangers here, Neil back in the back there, has been here for quite a while. He's an expert on this particular site, so we're happy to do that as well. And I know the author is also going to be taking some questions after her talk. So, Blanche, join us.
I'm really very moved to be here at the Theodore Roosevelt home. This is a reconstructed home that the 4 Roosevelt children lived in. And from Eleanor Roosevelt, let me just arrange this. From Eleanor Roosevelt's point of view, it was also Elliott Roosevelt's home. Theodore was one of 4 children, all of whom had a tremendous impact on Eleanor Roosevelt. Her uncle Theodore, her aunt Anna, who was called Bammy or Bai, and her aunt Corinne, and her father Elliott all grew up in this house. And at the end of the event, if you take the tour, you'll see on the 3rd floor there was a gymnasium where the brothers would box with each other. And it seems that they hated each other from an early age. They were very competitive with each other. And one of the things that fascinates me is that Eleanor Roosevelt was always trying to redeem her father's memory. And one of the things that I want to talk about is the impact of her father, Elliott Roosevelt, on her life, and I will talk about it, and of course feel free to ask questions. But it fascinated me that really virtually the first thing she did as First Lady-elect when FDR was first elected in 1932 was to collect her father's letters and to publish them with an introduction that she wrote. It was called Hunting Big Game in the 80s, in the 1880s. The letters of Elliott Roosevelt, sportsman. And if you look at the introduction, and it says, you know, Hunting Big Game in the 80s, letters of Elliott Roosevelt, sportsman, edited by his daughter, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you look at her introduction, there's an amazing sentence there in which he compares her father to her uncle. And she says something like, my father was really the natural athlete. He was faster, he was better, he was a better rider, he was a better shot. Uncle Theodore was a puny little boy and short-sighted all his life. And you get a sense of Eleanor Roosevelt's need to redeem her father, who died, as you may know if you've read volume 1 of my book, or indeed any of the biographies of Theodore Roosevelt. Eliot died when he was 34, and, you know, of alcoholism. A lot of us know terrific drinkers, even alcoholics, and they're in their 60s and 70s and 80s. I mean, just imagine how much you have to drink to die at the age of 34. And that gave, I think, Eleanor Roosevelt's effort to make life better for her family, for her mother, who also died very young. She died at the age of 29. And she died of diphtheria, but she essentially turned her face to the wall. This was a very embattled and tragical family disease. And Eleanor Roosevelt's effort to make things better for all people really, in my opinion, comes out of her great ardent desire to make things better for her family. And one of the things I was privileged, really, to go to the replay of Simone Boccanegra, this amazing opera, when it was redone just recently, about 5 or 6 years ago at the Metropolitan Opera. And it fascinated me because one of the most astonishing things Eleanor Roosevelt did to redeem her father's memory was to appear between Acts 1 and 2 of Simone Boccanegra and make this absolutely unannounced statement. I mean, nobody expected her to just stride onto the stage and make an appeal for depression-ruined Americans. And she said, in this rich country, it is a shameful tragedy to have anyone suffer or be hungry or homeless. And we must do everything we can possibly do. And of course, it's the height of the Depression. Her husband is not yet president, merely president-elect. It's the week before Christmas, December 11, 1932. And he's not inaugurated until March. And so I heard, when I listened to this opera, Simone Boccanegra, and I'd like to just read it to give you a sense of what moved Eleanor Roosevelt to stride on to that stage at intermission after she heard this aria. This, of course, is Verdi's profoundly stirring tale of politics, love, and longing. And Simone Boccanegra is the good father who is accidentally reunited with his long-lost daughter, Maria. And Eleanor Roosevelt hears this thrilling duet between father and daughter when he meets Maria by chance during a bright morning stroll. And she hears his lament, this is in the opera, for his country, its poverty and strife. And he sings, I weep over your fruitless harvests, and I cry out for peace. I cry out for love. And Maria walks over to Simone Boccanegra, and she notices that they're wearing matching pendants. And then there's this incredible aria when he discovers his long-lost daughter, and he sings, Filia tal nome io palpito. Daughter, at that moment I tremble as if heaven opened to me. And she has waited for this moment all her life, and she sings, Father, you shall see your watchful daughter always near you. I will wipe away your tears. We shall taste undiscovered joys. I will be the dove of peace of your royal palace. Well, it's a really kind of thrilling opera of reunited father, daughter, long lost, great tragedy. And it so mirrors Eleanor Roosevelt's emotional story. And that's when she strides onto the stage on 11 December, right after that aria. It's really incredible, and I tell the whole story in the first chapter of this book and set up hunting big game in the 1880s, which you'll see more of if you tour this wonderful reconstructed house. Eleanor Roosevelt was, as you all know, one of the most controversial first ladies in U.S. history, really arguably the most controversial First Lady in U.S. history. And before I leap into my paper, I'm going to take off my jacket. Excuse me. And she left us in the 1990s a very great legacy. And for me, after 18 years working on Eleanor Roosevelt, I think the greatest legacy that she left us is her conviction that government has only one purpose: to make things better for all people. And she always said, but you cannot depend on politicians to do anything about that. You really need to be part of a movement. And in order for things to get better for all people, she said, we need community activism, individual dedication, progressive movements. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very proud over the years to be part of the many movements that flourished from the 1930s until her death in 1962, and really flourish still. She was very proud to be part of the women's movement. She was very proud to be part of the peace movement and the movement for unionism, and of course the movement for racial justice. And one of the things that I think Volume 2 explores in a really new way is how vital the movement of race radicals, black and white, was during the 1930s. And so the civil rights movement really has to be redated when you look at what was going on in the 1930s. Issues of social justice, racial justice were very high on Eleanor Roosevelt's agenda, and she worked very closely with people like Mary McLeod Bethune and the great black educator, and Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and people like Virginia Durr, who died last year at the age of 95 and did so much to put the great civil rights movements of the 1960s really top of the national agenda. Eleanor Roosevelt's political and personal journey reflects the full range of the complex tides of the 20th century. She addressed the most controversial issues of state, none of which have become any less controversial. And at this moment, when there's a war here in New York City against public education, and really one could say a war against public education all over the country, and we are resegregating again, I'm sort of dazzled by a particular speech that Eleanor Roosevelt made as early as 11 May 1934. And this was a speech that she made in Washington at the American Education Association convention, which was the first convention where the educators of the United States condemned segregation, May 1934. And they condemned segregation really in words very similar to the words used in Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision of 1954, in which the court said segregation was a very bad thing. It harmed black children who grew up with the illusion that they were inferior, and it harmed white children who grew up with the illusion that they were superior, and it destroyed community in which our goal is to work and learn together. In 1934, after that resolution passed unanimously, Eleanor Roosevelt gave this speech. And her words today resonate with the urgency of this very moment. She said, I noticed in the papers this morning the figures given of the cost in certain states per capita for the education of a colored child and a white child. And I could not help but think how stupid we are. And I think it's so important that you use those words, how stupid we are. Since democracy depends above all on an educated citizenry, a literate, informed, and concerned people We should really bend our energies to giving to children the opportunity to develop their gifts to the utmost. To deny any part of a population the opportunities for more enjoyment in life, for higher aspirations, is a menace to the nation as a whole. She concluded with several really very stunning paragraphs, and this speech, if you are an educator and want to read it, is on page 184, 185 of Volume 2. But she said, there has been too much concentrating wealth. And even if it means that some of us have got to learn to be a little more unselfish about sharing what we have than we have been in the past, we must realize that it will profit us all in the long run. I think the day of selfishness is over. The day of really working together has come, regardless of race or creed or color. We must wipe out wherever we find it any feeling of intolerance, of belief that any one group can go ahead alone. We all go ahead together, or we will all go down together. 11 May 1934. That is, you know, I teach at the City University at a wonderful college called John Jay College, and I have to say, in all immodesty, my students are the best students in America. I teach police officers and firefighters and young people who want to be college educated, and they really work very hard. Just at this moment, I'm very proud that one of my students, Ken Thompson, is the chief prosecutor or the major prosecutor on the Abner Louima case. His mother was a single mom and a police officer. And so Kenneth Thompson went to John Jay, graduated with honors, went on to law school with honors. And if these rules that are intending to eviscerate and make it so hard for students to go to college were in place when Ken Thompson came into John Jay, he wouldn't have been at John Jay. And I have to say, I would not have graduated either. If you've ever looked at some of these raw tests in math, for example, that this mean-spirited administration here in our city and state say these kids have to pass, I mean, no faculty member wanted to take the test. Looked at it, didn't want to, nobody volunteered to take this test. So I mean, I can say I wouldn't have gone to school, Ken Thompson wouldn't have gone to school, and a lot of folks that I've interviewed wouldn't have been able to go to school. And I think this is truly a shameful moment, and everybody who has ever gone to the City University or any kind of public school should really begin to protest, as Eleanor Roosevelt said folks needed to do. From the 1930s, well, all of her life, she said folks needed to get involved and be involved and really fight for what we know is right. Eleanor Roosevelt's journey to greatness, her voyage out beyond the confines of good wife and devoted mother, involved determination and amazing courage. Eleanor Roosevelt always said that courage could be as contagious as fear, which is one of my favorite lessons from E.R. It also involved one of history's most unique partnerships. Franklin Delano Roosevelt admired his wife, appreciated her strengths, and depended on her integrity. E.R. and FDR had different priorities, occasionally competing goals, and often disagreed. Connected by trust, loyalty, and love, their partnership survived marital pain and affairs of the heart. They enjoyed different entertainments and preferred different people. They offered different advice to their adult children whose personal lives were frequently in turmoil. In the White House, they ran two distinct and separate courts. I spent a lot of time on their two distinct and separate courts in Volume 2, and I'll go into that in a little while. But I think one of the things that's amazing about Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt's separate courts is the measure of privacy that they were able to achieve in their lives, because a respectful press honored their privacy, which seems to me an important place to pause at this moment. Imagine, in 12 years in the White House, there's not one single published photograph of FDR on crutches or in a wheelchair. And Eleanor Roosevelt, who intended to manage the press and had press conferences for women journalists only, was also able to maintain an extraordinary amount of privacy. In the book, I detail an incredible moment when she and Lorena Hickok are determined to have privacy during a holiday, and they're in California, actually en route to one of the great national parks, one of my personal favorite parks in America, Yosemite National Park, and the press has kind of surrounded their hotel. They dive out the back door and are immediately followed by many cars with journalists in them, and there's a high-speed chase that resonates today in Princess Diana's tragic accident. They get up to about 80 miles an hour, and Eleanor Roosevelt pulls off the road and says to the reporters, "Let's go have breakfast at the diner we just passed, and you go call your publishers and go away, or I'm not going to leave." And so in one of America's first sit-ins, they do call their publishers. They agree to call the journalists off, and they are actually able to resume their holiday in private, which of course is an amazing thing as we contemplate the media absorption on things that have nothing to do with policy or human need today, which is one of our great, in my opinion, tragedies. I teach cops, so I always say, in my opinion, in my opinion, in my opinion, 3 times when I say anything controversial. So in my opinion, it is a great tragedy. Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt did not have a traditional, correct, or conventionally happy marriage, but it was one of Washington's most notably successful marriages. Fueled by power, they were each dedicated to making life better for all people. Together, they did more than either could have done alone. E.R. served her husband's interests and was his primary ambassador to neighborhood people, to poor and hardworking and hidden communities in the mountains and deltas of America. She brought folks who could not vote and until the New Deal did not count into the mainstream of American public life. On divisive issues, which he would have preferred to ignore, notably issues of race and racism, she was his conscience, proud to be, as she put it on occasion, his hair shirt. E.R. was 48 when she entered the White House. Her understanding of life and politics was informed and galvanized by love. Many people have asked me why I spend so much time on her relationships with people like Earl Miller and Lorena Hickok. Why don't I just talk about the politics and the political convictions that she had? And the answer to that question is really very simple. Eleanor Roosevelt's entire life was fueled by love. And we know enough today about emotional reality to know that love is an experiential thing, not an abstraction. And so it really matters to me that Eleanor Roosevelt had love in her life. There is a moral in this book, and that is no woman should ever give up her career for the person she loves. And once Lorena Hickok, who everybody called Hick, gave up her career as the highest paid Associated Press reporter, the nature of their relationship changes and diminishes. Hick becomes despondent and unhappy, and Eleanor Roosevelt becomes impatient, and she's on to other things. But Eleanor Roosevelt is a very competitive woman, which I'll talk about later. And it sort of fascinates me as I think about the kind of competition that she really indulged in. That when FDR had an affair first with Lucy Mercer, that first affair, which he discovered in 1918, really almost destroyed their marriage. But they got over that. And then he brought his great assistant and woman who Eleanor Roosevelt always treated as a junior wife, Missy LeHand, into the Roosevelt hearth. And Missy LeHand was FDR's secretary, assistant, and really, as I said, Eleanor Roosevelt always treated her as a junior wife. She's really FDR's other partner. She arrives about 1920. And in 1923, Eleanor Roosevelt wrote what I've always thought is one of the most telling articles. It's called The Women of Tibet, in which she said, "It has been brought to my attention that the women of Tibet have many husbands, which seems to me a very good thing, since so many husbands have so many wives." So I think, you know, when I think about competition and Eleanor Roosevelt, it makes perfect sense that she had relations and friendships with many people. And for the details, you'll have to read my book. Before Eleanor Roosevelt entered the White House, she cast about for models to understand her new role and decide just what she might do from within the confines of the president's house. The record was grim, and every one of her 20th century predecessors sickened or died in the place. Indeed, Theodore Roosevelt's wife, who in many ways was the first modern First Lady, had terrible migraine headaches and frequently took to her bed with these crushing headaches. And I spend a lot of time in Chapter 1 of Volume 2 talking about her 20th century predecessors. It's quite a shocking and stunning story, which demonstrates that Washington for decades has been a lethal town for wives, with an odious history for women. Tough and resilient, E.R. set out to create another example. Surrounded by her own support network, she intended to survive the ordeal of first wifery. Eleanor Roosevelt was not a saint, and though often long-suffering, she could be mean and cold and disagreeable. Initially, she went everywhere with rambunctious dogs. They growled and snarled, barked and nipped, bolted and chased. Like her head housekeeper, Henrietta Nesbitt, who ruined the president's food on a regular basis and was rude and unkind, E.R.'s dogs represented an unacknowledged part of her character. E.R. rarely expressed anger directly, but when she grew cold, she could freeze the stoutest heart. She never fired Henrietta Nesbitt, who remained head housekeeper for 12 whole years, and she parted with her dogs after they had lunged at several children and bit at least one diplomat, one senator, and one friendly woman reporter. Then she parted with her dog. So I have to tell you, I spent a lot of time wondering about why Eleanor Roosevelt never fired Henrietta Nesbitt and contemplating her menus of little horrors. This book came in at about 2,000 pages, and actually on the cutting room floor are some of these really ghastly menus. She ruined salads on a regular basis. Her steamed vegetables were runny. And these were foods that Eleanor Roosevelt most particularly cared about. In fact, she sent Henrietta Nesbitt to New York to Schrafft's to learn how to steam vegetables. And then Henrietta Nesbitt returned and said, well, I've learned how to do that. But then I discovered that if you take the broth they were cooked in and poured them all over the vegetables, they'd be even more flavorful, thereupon ruining those steamed vegetables again. And she tossed her hideous salads with things like marshmallows and other things. Many people learned to eat before they were invited to dine at the White House. And you really do have to pause to wonder, since Eleanor Roosevelt could have had the services of the best chefs in America, or indeed the world, and wine stewards as well. I mean, I spend some time talking about her equally ghastly wines and champagnes, which after years of prohibition came from places like New York State. I mean, it's truly scandalous. And I was fascinated that Bess Truman fired Henrietta Nesbitt within the first week that she spent in the White House. And I decided, actually, that it was really the way Eleanor Roosevelt could get back at her gourmet husband on a kind of relentless and regular basis. And it is an important part of the story, so you have to read my chapter on Henrietta Nesbitt. As First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt did things that had never been done before. She upset race traditions, championed a New Deal for women, and on certain issues actually ran a parallel administration. On housing and the creation of model communities, for example, ER made decisions and engineered policy. And again, this is a subject that Eleanor Roosevelt spent a great deal of time on, and I spent significant time on also in Volume 2. There's a wonderful community called Arthurdale, which is in Preston County, West Virginia. And this is a community that is a great model of what could happen today if we were serious about making things better for people. It's a community where 83% of the initial residents and their children and grandchildren continue to live there. And it's a community where Eleanor Roosevelt was told by Lorena Hickok, who when she quit the Associated Press got a job with the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and a man named Clarence Pickett, who became Eleanor Roosevelt's great friend and supporter, the head of the American Friends Service Committee. If you want to see the worst place in Depression America, come on down here to Preston County, West Virginia, where folks were living in caves and culverts or above a stream that was basically a sewer, and people were starving to death. And it really was the worst place that she had ever seen. And she vowed she would get these folks out of those caves and culverts by Christmas. And FDR supported her effort. And as a biographer, I sort of wondered why she spent so much time on housing. And it meant a lot to me that this woman who was orphaned at 10, who after she was orphaned never really lived in a home of her own. She lived in her grandmother's house, and her grandmother probably saved her life. And then she went away to school, where she was benefited by a terrific and encouraging relationship with Marie Souvestre, the headmistress at Allenswood School. And then she returned to marry FDR and live in her mother-in-law's homes, which she hated. And then she lived in these public houses, you know, the State House and the White House. And so this woman who never had a home of her own took it upon herself as her most important task to make sure that folks had affordable and decent housing all over America. And there's a wonderful biography in the works. Richard Lieberman is doing a biography of Senator Robert Wagner. And with Wagner, she really introduced the first Affordable Housing Act, and I'd love to talk about that later. But this was something that really was Eleanor Roosevelt's main issue. And in Preston County, West Virginia, she created this community called Arthurdale. She went back every year until her death and supported it in many, many ways. And one of the things that fascinated me was the details that she took charge of. At a time when about 80% of rural America had no modern conveniences, Eleanor Roosevelt insisted these houses be built with all modern conveniences on 2 to 5 acres, including electricity and indoor plumbing, including toilets and bathtubs and showers. And there were heating ranges in every room. There were sun porches and back porches. It's really an amazing place. The houses are modest and small, but they really do have all modern conveniences. And even today, where in this area in the country where, in the mountains where temperatures plunge to 30, 40 degrees below zero, every single room is snug and warm and comfortable. And when Eleanor Roosevelt decided that's how they were going to be built, everybody was aghast, including FDR and members of his cabinet, even Harold Ickes, who is the father of this Harold Ickes you hear so much about. And Harold Ickes was not notably a mean-spirited man, but he said, if Eleanor Roosevelt has her way, how are we going to tell the rich from the poor? And Eleanor Roosevelt said, well, it matters of such simple dignity and decency, we should not have to tell the rich from the poor. And so they were built to her specifications, even to the kind of refrigerator that was put into these houses. At first they were going to be left out, and her great friend Louis Howe said, oh, that would break Eleanor Roosevelt's heart. She personally had shopped for the refrigerators. And then they were planted with rhododendron and mountain laurel, and they were built to her specifications. This is a very important issue today, because today there are 7 to 10 million homeless Americans, and it's an issue that politicians are simply not talking about. Democrats aren't talking about it, and Republicans aren't talking about it, but everywhere you go in this great country, folks are going to work from their trucks and their vans and their cars, and there are people living in the subways of this great city. 7 to 10 million homeless Americans, many of them all over the country, intact families, and it really is an astonishing and shameful fact. And of course, as you know, I mean, Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter and Habitat for Humanity have made this a popular issue, but it's not a government issue. Politicians aren't talking about it, and Jimmy and Rosalind Carter don't take any government money or haven't to date. And I really think this is an enormous issue, and it really should be made once again into a popular political issue, especially when you factor in that since Ronald Reagan, not one federal dollar has been invested in new housing starts. And so affordable housing just doesn't really exist any longer in most of the great cities of this country. And I was very interested that in September, the religious leaders of America declared that housing was a sacred right. And if you look at the Declaration of Human Rights, which Eleanor Roosevelt did so much to negotiate, one of the human rights in that great declaration, which is really the model for the future, is the right to education, to housing, and to health. And the religious leaders have all connected education, housing, and health in almost the same language Eleanor Roosevelt did back in the 1930s. When one pauses to contemplate all that Eleanor Roosevelt actually did and the tremendous and controversial stands that she took, it's important, or at least important for a biographer, to pause and ask, how did she get that way? In addition to telling her friends courage can be as contagious as fear, she always told her friends, if you have to compromise, be sure to compromise up, which I thought was very good advice. One key to her great strength was a line that I found in a book that she wrote at the age of 76, just 2 years before her death. She wrote a book called You Learn by Living, in which she said, "The happiest day of my life was the day that I made the first team at field hockey." Now, I really, biographers pause over these telltale signs. I really pondered that. The happiest day of her life was the day that she made the first team at field hockey. And this is after all of her achievements and struggles and friendships all over the world. And I got it. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very competitive woman who loved the knockabout field of sports. I think she'd really be happy with the new soccer reality and Title IX. But beyond that, her chosen field of sports was politics. And Eleanor Roosevelt hated to lose. And when I realized that competition was really at the core of some of her decisions, a lot of things fell into place. For example, in 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt set herself the task of earning as much money as Franklin earned as president, which in 1933 was $75,000 a year. Well, if you multiply that by a factor of 10, you get essentially a 1990s dollar, which is a lot of money. And she did it by doing things that would be shocking and unacceptable today. She did it by accepting commercially sponsored broadcasts from, a whole variety of, one has to say it, tacky sponsors, and had to turn down. I mean, FDR put his foot down only occasionally on domestic issues, and he put his foot down when she was about to take a cigarette sponsor. And she wrote a friend saying, "I had to turn that down, which is really too bad since it paid twice as much as the mattress sponsor." And at the end of the year, she wrote a friend, "I've done it. I've earned as much as Franklin." And this is sort of amazing to me. And then when she decided to do her women-only press conferences, she wrote, "Hick, the press conference was very nice, and the best part of it is I beat Franklin. He's not holding his first conference until next week." So there is this competitive edge, which really one begins to look for. And the other part of her great gift is her tremendous empathy for all people. And it's that ability to identify with people in want and in need and in trouble that really is the other key to the great mystery of her greatness. And that really does come from whatever the childhood was in this house. Her commitment to her father, who the family had condemned as a wicked and undeserving person, and she always admired as a truly loving and warm person, who gave his new winter coat away one Christmas to a hungry boy who was selling newspapers. And so she turned her incredible family grief into this galvanizing empathy. And one of the things that Eleanor Roosevelt did was to visit prisons, women's prisons, annually. And again, at this moment when we're cutting all public education and we're cutting prison education, we've just destroyed the Pell Grants for prison education. And I've taught through John Jay at Rikers Island for many years, and we know that these prison education programs work. And this is, I think, and Dostoevsky was right. You can tell about a nation by how it treats its prisoners. And Eleanor Roosevelt really understood that. And after she would visit the women's prison at Alderson, for example, she would write her friends things like, "I could have been any one of..." And sometimes too. But I think it was beyond that, her ability truly to empathize and to realize that what everybody needs is encouragement and hope, education, health, and housing. And so she has left us this really sacred and important legacy. And so we can only be grateful to her and join movements for social change that need once again to go on. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions or comments. C-SPAN is here with microphones. Do you want to run around with it, or I'll just repeat it? Okay. Yes. You want to identify yourself?
Evie Adams, ex-bonsai who's been in Israel for the last 30 years and happens to be here in the Middle East world. About book one, which is one of my treasures, I've learned to serve privileged human beings. I can just tell you I had a lot of anger because you stopped at a certain point and I was waiting for you to go on. And one of the few biographies where, I've wept. A thought was about the tragic childhood, Mademoiselle being really one of the few decent human beings in her life, and then getting married and having Sarah. And I was at Hyde Park a year or so ago, and seeing the 3 bedrooms upstairs, and how Mommy was next to him, and she was so far away. And okay, she had Valkill and the rest of her life and the love and whatever, but basically this was, alone and rejection. And how did she do it? I just had such sadness and such feeling for her in that house. I don't know, I just felt Sarah was in there and the ghost wasn't going to go away. She's going to torture everybody forever, And just this terrible sadness and, of course, admiration and courage and everything else. But this is just, I think, something so amazing. And on the other hand, never having had any good parenting, how she screwed up with her kids. I just thought this was just so amazing.
Well, those are really very provocative remarks. And it's true that Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt was a great interfering presence in their marriage and during the early years of their marriage. And if you visit Hyde Park, it really is shocking to see the bedroom geography at Springwood, the Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt's family home, because Eleanor Roosevelt's bedroom is a little bedroom off to a corner, which was the geography that occurred after polio. There are pictures of the earlier period when they, of course, shared a big double bed. But Sarah is absolutely the dominant presence. These are her houses. And on both East 65th Street, which Eleanor Roosevelt very happily turned over to Hunter College immediately after Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt died in 1941, and this was a kind of double brownstone home, not unlike this house here, where 2 families could live with some privacy, but Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt had sliding doors installed on each floor and would appear even on the bedroom floor at any hour of the day or night. And the most astonishing thing, I think, about Springwood is that there are only 2 easy chairs on either side of the hearth. Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt's chair and FDR's chair. And Eleanor had no place really to sit, and sat on the floor or, somewhere away from the center of power. And at the table, at the great formal dining room table, the head of the dining room table was always Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt, and the other head was always FDR, and Eleanor sat with the children and guests in the middle somewhere, anywhere there was a seat. And so this is kind of a shocking thing. It's easy to dismiss Sarah Eleanor Roosevelt as the Schwiger from hell. That means mother-in-law. But she was very complicated. And at one point, I was very struck by how she grew politically over time and becomes really a great supporter of the causes that Eleanor Roosevelt supports. For instance, she is the closest friend to Mary McLeod Bethune. And it's through Mary McLeod Bethune's friendship with Sarah Delano Roosevelt that she becomes friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And then there's a remarkable afternoon when they're at the White House waiting for FDR to return from a cruise. And it's Eleanor Roosevelt, Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and Sarah Delano Roosevelt there to urge FDR to speak out in favor of an anti-lynch law, which he never does, by the way. And Walter White is giving FDR his many arguments, and FDR says, you know, you have all these arguments. Has my wife been coaching you? And Walter White doesn't quite answer that, and then he turns to his mother expecting some support, and Sarah Delano Roosevelt absolutely agrees with Walter White. Then I discovered that she was the one who did all the fundraising for things like Lillian Wald's Henry Street settlement and the public health nurse service, the visiting home nurse service, the height of the Depression. And I thought, well, that's remarkable. And so I asked one of Eleanor Roosevelt's nieces, a wonderful woman named Eleanor Roosevelt, and she has on her license plate ER2. And I called her up in California. I said, are we all being too hard on Sarah Delano Roosevelt, or is she really a better person than we think she is? And politically, I think she is a better person than I had thought she was. And Ellie ER2 said, don't even go there. Don't even think about it. She was a monster to Eleanor Roosevelt and to Eleanor Roosevelt's family, to her brother Hall, who was an embattled alcoholic like her father was, and to his daughters, and that's who, you know, he had 3 daughters, ER2, a wonderful woman named Diana Roosevelt Jakes, who really did incredibly wonderful work, and Janet Roosevelt Catton, who is a wonderful artist. And they all 3 of them said Sarah Delano Roosevelt was not a nice person, was very mean to Eleanor Roosevelt, and never missed an opportunity to deride her in public and in front of the family. And I tell some of the stories in Volume 2. And so there really is a kind of bitterness to this reality. I'm very grateful to the archivists and docents of these marvelous public houses who really know some history. And when I went to the White House, I was greeted by the curators of the White House who showed me a series of photographs of what the White House looked like in the Roosevelt during the Roosevelt presidency. And there are 2 things that really stand out. One is that in FDR's office, in the main Oval Office where he did his work, when he sat at his desk, he had his wife, a portrait of his wife behind him, and he could look at his mother for approval. And I thought that was a very interesting placement of portraits. And then in his room, which was right next to Eleanor Roosevelt's bedroom and sitting room, there had been sliding doors. And at one point, FDR put a 7-drawer, very high, 6'5" high boy, to block the sliding door so that Eleanor Roosevelt couldn't really just have entry in. And that was very interesting to me because Eleanor Roosevelt had put a similar high boy in their bedroom area at East 65th Street to keep Sarah out. So there's a lot of family tension here, as you might imagine. Yes?
You said that she was extremely controversial in terms of being the president's wife. I think our president's wife is just as controversial, maybe more so, and has had success and failures, namely the health issue a few years ago. How do you think she would look upon her running for office? Because Eleanor never ran for office, did she?
No.
No. How do you think she looks upon Hillary coming back to New York, or coming to New York, and running for office?
Thank you very much for that question. I think many of us are very pleased that Hillary Rodham Clinton has said that she wants to walk in Eleanor Roosevelt's shoes and that she's inspired by Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy. And I personally have great faith that if Hillary Rodham Clinton runs for office, she will really try to do some of the things that she has for many years really stood for. And if you think about her work for the Children's Defense Fund, before she became First Lady, we know that she really does believe in public education and quality, excellent education for all children. And there are many things that Eleanor Roosevelt believed in that Hillary Rodham Clinton believes in. I have to say there's a marvelous non-review of my book in The Nation, the September 20th issue of The Nation by Elsa Dixler. And it's called Eleanor Roosevelt to Hillary Rodham Clinton. And it's a wonderful use of my book to say, listen, it's a letter from Eleanor to Hillary, and it says, you know, I'm so pleased that you're thinking about me, dear. And since you're trying to channel me, let me make it easier for you. And Elsa Dixler goes through my book saying, these are the things that I believed in that you haven't really spoken about. And what do you really think? And we're waiting to hear what you really think about these things. And there are two issues. On education, we know that Hillary Rodham Clinton would make a much better senator or any kind of leader than our current leadership, because they have declared crude and brute war against public education and against CUNY, the city university system, and the state university system. When it comes to health care, we would like her to try again. And I would like to just go back, if I may. One of the things that I didn't talk about two things. I didn't talk about some of the specific legislation that the New Deal was all about and Eleanor Roosevelt's response to it. And Eleanor Roosevelt really is the only First Lady in U.S. history to leap for her pen when she disagreed with her husband. And I really do show some of these major disagreements in my book. One of them is about Social Security. The Social Security law of 1935, which is really what makes the New Deal the New Deal. It was the best that we had. It's where the government says, okay, we're really responsible, the federal government is really responsible for the well-being of American citizens. The fact is, the 1935 Social Security Act was a terrible compromise, and it was supposed to have 4 parts. It was supposed to have a health insurance, national health care component, which FDR scrambled like within weeks of this bill going through its congressional phase. He said, I have too much to worry about to deal with health care. And the United States then never came up again, except when Dwight David Eisenhower brought it up in 1957, and it became something called the Health Reinsurance Act. Dwight David Eisenhower had wanted, as the people around Eleanor Roosevelt had wanted, absolutely universal, comprehensive health insurance. And he said, let's do it the way we do it in the military. As the former commander-in-chief of the armed forces, you know, we all in the military have cradle-to-the-grave health security. Let's do it that way. And he appointed head of the WACS, not a notably radical woman, Oveta Culp-Hobby, to be the first chair of the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, which Eisenhower introduced, okay? And the AMA lobbied it to death, just the way they lobbied it to death in 1935. And so the U.S. today is one can say one of the only major industrial nation without a national health care program. There used to be 2, South Africa and the United States. But South Africa, you know, has had a revolution. And so now it's really only the United States without a reasonable, decent, single-payer, like Canada, health plan situation. And Eleanor Roosevelt's great friend, Esther Lape, fought for a national health care program until her death at the age of 100 in 1984. And she was part of, her organization was called the American Foundation. And her name, Esther Lape, and I always tell groups of writers and scholars and students, you know, if you're looking for a new biography, Lape, L-A-P-E. Nobody's really ever written about her in any significant way. And when Roosevelt ended their campaign for the World Court, which is another thing that I spend a lot of time on in this book, he threatened them with ending their tax exemption if they continued to lobby for the World Court, also in 1935, and they turned their attention to a national health care program. So it was Esther Lape, Elizabeth Reed, Eleanor Roosevelt, and a wonderfully progressive Republican, there used to be such things, progressive Republicans, named Helen Rogers Reed, who is one of Eleanor Roosevelt's great friends and the publisher of the Herald Tribune, wife of the publisher of the Herald Tribune, New York Herald Tribune. And they campaigned for this national health care program. When Eisenhower signed his compromise bill, he gave the pen that he signed it with to Esther Lape. And she waved it in front of the press, you know, the big press conference, and she said, now this represents just a puny little bone in the vertebrae of what I had in mind. And that was the end of it. It really has never come up again until Hillary Rodham Clinton and President Clinton brought it up, and then we know what a terrible failure and compromise it was. In 1935, Eleanor Roosevelt went on a national tour to say, this Social Security law is a terribly flawed piece of legislation, and I will not be satisfied until it is universal and covers these things: health security, housing security, job security. Now, job security in 1935 was dealt with in a compromised way by the WPA. But the WPA, which got real jobs to real people at real wages in their own areas of work, artists could be artists, and musicians could be musicians, and dancers could be dancers, and so on, was a temporary agency. And it was supposed to be, like Social Security, a permanent situation, job security, full employment. And the only thing of the four parts, health security, housing security, job security, that actually was in the Social Security package as a permanent thing was old age insurance. And one has to say the 1935 law was riddled with discrimination. Entire categories of workers were excluded from the 1935 package. And if you pause to look at who was excluded, you'll see how women were excluded and how African Americans were excluded. The jobs that were excluded include all domestic workers, all agricultural workers, all teachers, all nurses, all nonprofits, all state, local, and federal government workers, all merchant marine, seamen. And so if you think about, and all businesses with under 10 people, all small businesses, all service workers. I think I said that. So virtually 80% of African American workers and women were excluded. And Eleanor Roosevelt was really outraged by that. And the great tragedy about this shredding of the safety net that has gone on during the Clinton administration, and everybody's angry that Hillary Rodham Clinton did not leap to her pen to protest, is that it really sets the social justice clock back 100 years. If you think about who Eleanor Roosevelt brought into the White House, Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, Florence Kelley, these are the women who said things like, we have to have health care for infants and mothers. And they fought from the 1880s until 1921 when a bill named Shepard-Towner was signed by, are you ready, Warren Gamaliel Harding, okay? So they wanted there to be well baby clinics, public health nursing, nutritional information for all infants and mothers. Well, we have this dreadful case of Tabitha Winrud in this city, in New York City, a young African-American mother whose baby was being breastfed and starved to death. She has been convicted of murdering her baby, although she went to emergency rooms 4 times and was told that, well, she didn't have insurance and she didn't have Medicaid and she should come back in 4 months when she had Medicaid. Well, if Shepard Towner, and I talk about Shepard Towner in Volume 2, because Eleanor Roosevelt really fought for it, and really fought for it to come up again in 1935, and it became part of Social Security. That's what's been shredded. And now the barriers, and the Visiting Home Nurse Service has acknowledged that the barriers to Medicaid for mothers and children, which should be automatic, have been raised so high, this kind of thing is going to go on all the time. And that's what it means that we've shredded the safety net. We've really literally turned the social justice clock back 100 years. I must say, I've been on this book tour, and I've gone all over the country, and everywhere I've gone, I think people are really tired of the politics of cruelty. And they're aware that there's a very terrible Nazi movement out there. I mean, black churches are being firebombed. Jewish synagogues have been firebombed. People are being lynched again. We're in real trouble today as a nation. And if you look around the world, we're in real trouble again in the world. And I think folks, everywhere I have gone, folks have said, well, what can we do? Eleanor Roosevelt said, you're not going to depend on these politicians. You have to organize. And you have to organize block by block, door to door, community by community. That's what Eleanor Roosevelt encouraged everybody to do. That's what she did, you know, and she went everywhere. She spoke everywhere. She had a daily column, My Day, from 1936 to the end of her life. Then she had a radio program. Then she had a television program. I mean, and all of us who write and teach have now a great need to pursue this politics of responsibility, which is what Eleanor Roosevelt's politics was all about. And we have to get back some of this amazingly lost ground. We've lost some ground in the 1980s and the 1990s. They weren't homeless people before the 1980s the way they're on now. You know, Eisenhower, like Roosevelt, Eisenhower really had this great building campaign, affordable housing in every community. Actually, there was an office in Eisenhower's White House. Every homeowner is a capitalist, okay? It was part of our Cold War competition. We could do it better than they could, and we could maintain capitalism. With the end of the Cold War, we have no need to compete, and so folks are ignoring what's the real dreadful situation that people are enduring. And if I had one piece of advice for Hillary Rodham Clinton, I would tell her to forget the polls and remember the people. And it was when Eleanor Roosevelt went against the so-called, you know, advisors to the Democratic Party and bucked the pollsters that her rating in the polls skyrocketed, which they did. When she spoke out, she got tremendous amount of support, although she was one of the most reviled and hated first ladies. Every time, I think we forget how truly bigoted America was in the 1930s. Every time she spoke at a black church or a Jewish temple, she received the most unbearable and egregious hate mail in language that we simply don't use today. And there's one chapter in the book called A Silence Beyond Repair, where I talk about the one issue that FDR actually silenced Eleanor Roosevelt on, and that was what was going on in Nazi Europe. The U.S. pursued a heartbreaking policy of, quote, isolationism, and we just did not want to have anything to do with Europe's woes. And the tragedy of it is that, as you'll see if you read my book, is that there were several opportunities really to take a stand, early opportunities. In June 1933 at the London Economic Conference, which FDR, for reasons that I still do not understand, but one of my graduate students is now writing his doctoral dissertation, After my lecture on this, he decided, he's a Vietnam veteran, he said, that's what I'll write my dissertation on. The London Economic Conference, Roosevelt just destroyed the London Economic Conference. And when Hitler said, okay, that's fine, that's just what I've been saying all along, economic nationalism. And it was really the end of any effort to have a kind of international economic policy that might have eased tensions worldwide as all of the major powers were going through this global depression. And then in 1935, as it was clear that Hitler was really making great strides in the area of what we now call the Balkans, and he was moving clearly into Austria and then Hungary and then Romania and so on. There was a great need to join the World Court and take a stand as an important international player. Eleanor Roosevelt went on the air many times, wrote 5 or 6 articles saying we must join the World Court now. And FDR was asked to say one public word, refused to say one public word, and the court lost yet again in the Senate in 1935 by 6 votes. And the World Court didn't come up again until the end of World War II, just like what went on at the London Economic Conference didn't come up again until the Bretton Woods Conference that ended World War II. So these are great tragedies. And then the silence beyond repair is, of course, in my opinion, a great tragedy. At one point, I almost didn't want to finish writing this book, but then I learned by reading Varian Fry's memoir. And Varian Fry, if you can catch this Holocaust Museum show that has been in New York and it's been on a national tour. Varian Fry was the Scarlet Pimpernel who went to Marseille just as the doors to Europe were really crashing shut and got out 2,000 of the so-called best and the brightest. People like Pablo Casals and Marc Chagall and Hannah Arendt and Wanda Landowska, you know, very famous people. And he wrote in his memoir, which has just been republished, Surrender on Demand, which is what the French government issued an edict ordering, surrender on demand. He wrote, "Nothing I did could have been achieved without Eleanor Roosevelt." And that gave me more pause, and I went and looked in other places for what she might have been doing that was less public, covert, because Varian Fry's operation was a covert operation. I mean, it was, you know, forged passports, peroxide, costumes, laundered money, smuggled in and out. It was really an incredible operation. And then I found in State Department records and refugee records that Eleanor Roosevelt really made a very great effort to find sanctuary, to bring people in, to extend visas, and to be supportive of Varian Fry's operation, which the State Department terminated before it was over and arrested Varian Fry. Eleanor Roosevelt worked very hard to get Varian Fry out of prison. So that's a very dramatic story. You have to wait for volume 3. For that story. But A Silence Beyond Repair is a very bitter moment. Well, thank you very much. You don't have to wait to read Volume 1. You can go right to Volume 2. I have a nice introduction that walks you right in. Thank you. I think Volume 1 is worth reading. It sets it all up. Thank you.
Blanche Wiesen Cook teaches history at John Jay College, and she's senior editor of the Garland Library of War and Peace. Viking Penguin publishes her biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. It's available in hardback, paperback, and audio.
Theodore, her aunt Anna, who is called Bammy or Bai, and her aunt Corinne, and her father Elliot all grew up in this house. And at the end of the event, if you take the tour, you'll see on the 3rd floor there was a gymnasium where the brothers would box with each other. And it seems that they hated each other from an early age. They were very competitive with each other. And one of the things that fascinates me is that Eleanor Roosevelt was always trying to redeem her father's memory. And one of the things that I want to talk about is the impact of her father, Elliott Roosevelt, on her life. And I will talk about it. And of course, feel free to ask questions. But it fascinated me that really virtually the first thing she did as First Lady-elect when FDR was first elected in 1932 was to collect her father's letters and to publish them with an introduction that she wrote. It was called Hunting Big Game in the 80s, in the 1880s. The letters of Elliott Roosevelt, sportsman. And if you look at the introduction, and it says, you know, Hunting Big Game in the 80s, letters of Elliott Roosevelt, sportsman, edited by his daughter, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you look at her introduction, there's an amazing sentence there in which she compares her father to her uncle. And she says something like, my father was really the natural athlete. He was faster, he was better, he was a better rider, he was a better shot. Uncle Theodore was a puny little boy and short-sighted all his life. And you get a sense of Eleanor Roosevelt's need to redeem her father, who died, as you may know if you've read volume 1 of my book, or indeed any of the biographies of Theodore Roosevelt. Elliott died when he was 34, and, you know, of alcoholism. A lot of us know terrific drinkers, even alcoholics, and they're in their 60s and 70s and 80s. I mean, just imagine how much you have to drink to die at the age of 34. And that gave, I think, Eleanor Roosevelt's effort to make life better for her family, for her mother, who also died very young. She died at the age of 29. And she died of diphtheria, but she essentially turned her face to the wall. This was a very embattled and tragical family disease. And Eleanor Roosevelt's effort to make things better for all people really, in my opinion, comes out of her great ardent desire to make things better for her family. And one of the things I was privileged, really, to go to the replay of Simone Boccanegra, this amazing opera, when it was redone just recently, about 5 or 6 years ago at the Metropolitan Opera. And it fascinated me because one of the most astonishing things Eleanor Roosevelt did to redeem her father's memory was to appear between Acts 1 and 2 of Simone Boccanegra and make this absolutely unannounced statement. I mean, nobody expected her to just stride onto the stage and make an appeal for depression-ruined Americans. And she said, in this rich country, it is a shameful tragedy to have anyone suffer or be hungry or homeless. And we must do everything we can possibly do. And of course, it's the height of the Depression. Her husband is not yet president, merely president-elect. It's the week before Christmas, December 11, 1932. And he's not inaugurated until March. And so I heard, when I listened to this opera, Simone Boccanegra, and I'd like to just read it to give you a sense of what moved Eleanor Roosevelt to stride on to that stage at intermission after she heard this aria. This, of course, is Verdi's profoundly stirring tale of politics, love, and longing. And Simone Boccanegra is the good father who is accidentally reunited with his long-lost daughter, Maria. And Eleanor Roosevelt hears this
Hillary Rodham Clinton is the only First Lady in history to become a U.S. Senator. Next, historian Blanche Wiesen-Cook discusses her biography of another First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Her remarks on the second volume in her series are about an hour, 15 minutes.
Everybody, I'd like to welcome you to the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace. My name is Doug Kumar, and I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Manhattan Sites. For those of you who haven't been to the site before, when you hear the term Manhattan Sites, it gets confusing, but what it is, we have 6 historic sites, all operated as basically one large national park here in Manhattan, as opposed to Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, which is a separate park, and Gateway, which is a separate park. So in Manhattan Sites, we have Castle Clinton National Monument and Battery Park, Federal Hall and Wall Street, Theodore Roosevelt birthplace, Hamilton Grange, Alexander Hamilton's home on 130th, the infamous Grant's tomb, and St. Paul Grant's tomb, and St. Paul's Church at Mount Vernon. So those are our 6 sites, and they represent history all the way from the Revolutionary War all the way up to Teddy Roosevelt and his Battle of San Juan Hill. So we have a remarkable array of resources, historic resources in our city. And I think my favorite is Teddy Roosevelt's. And today you're all here for one reason, to hear our author, our renowned author, Blanche Cook, and talking about her new book, second volume of Eleanor Roosevelt. Not Theodore, Eleanor. she may refer to Theodore, but I think it's... Anyway, welcome again to the site. After the tour is over, after the talk is over, if anyone is interested, we will be taking tours of the site. And our rangers here, Neil back in the back there, has been here for quite a while, is an expert on this particular site, so we're happy to do that as well. And I know the author is also going to be taking some questions after her talk. So, Blanche, join us.
I'm really very moved to be here at the Theodore Roosevelt home. This is a reconstructed home that the 4 Roosevelt children lived in. And from Eleanor Roosevelt, let me just arrange this. From Eleanor Roosevelt's point of view, it was also Elliott Roosevelt's home. Theodore was one of 4 children, all of whom had a tremendous impact on Eleanor Roosevelt. Her uncle, thrilling duet between father and daughter when he meets Maria by chance during a bright morning stroll. And she hears his lament, this is in the opera, for his country, its poverty and strife, and he sings, "I weep over your fruitless harvests, and I cry out for peace. I cry out for love." And Maria walks over to Simone Boccanegra, and she notices that they're wearing matching pendants, and then there's this incredible aria when he discovers his long-lost daughter, and he sings, "Filia tal nome io palpito." Daughter, at that moment I tremble as if heaven opened to me. And she has waited for this moment all her life, and she sings, "Father, you shall see your watchful daughter always near you. I will wipe away your tears. We shall taste undiscovered joys. I will be the dove of peace of your royal palace." Well, it's a really kind of thrilling opera of reunited father, daughter, long lost, great tragedy. And it so mirrors Eleanor Roosevelt's emotional story. And that's when she strides onto the stage on 11 December, right after that aria. It's really incredible, and I tell the whole story in the first chapter of this book and set up hunting big game in the 1880s, which you'll see more of if you tour this wonderful reconstructed house. Eleanor Roosevelt was, as you all know, one of the most controversial first ladies in U.S. history, really arguably the most controversial first lady in U.S. history. And before I leap into my paper, I'm going to take off my jacket. Excuse me. And she left us in the 1990s a very great legacy. And for me, after 18 years working on Eleanor Roosevelt, I think the greatest legacy that she left us is her conviction that government has only one purpose: to make things better for all people. And she always said, but you cannot depend on politicians to do anything about that. You really need to be part of a movement. And in order for things to get better for all people, she said, we need community activism, individual dedication, progressive movements. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very proud over the years to be part of the many movements that flourished from the 1930s until her death in 1962, and really flourish still. She was very proud to be part of the women's movement. She was very proud to be part of the peace movement and the movement for unionism, and of course the movement for racial justice. And one of the things that I think Volume 2 explores in a really new way is how vital the movement of race radicals, black and white, was during the 1930s. And so the civil rights movement really has to be redated when you look at what was going on in the 1930s. Issues of social justice, racial justice were very high on Eleanor Roosevelt's agenda, and she worked very closely with people like Mary McLeod Bethune, and the great black educator, and Walter White, the head of the NAACP, and people like Virginia Durr, who died last year at the age of 95 and did so much to put the great civil rights movements of the 1960s really top of the national agenda. Eleanor Roosevelt's political and personal journey reflects the full range of the complex tides of the 20th century. She addressed the most controversial issues of state, none of which have become any less controversial. And at this moment, when there's a war here in New York City against public education, and really one could say a war against public education all over the country, and we are resegregating again, I'm sort of dazzled by a particular speech that Eleanor Roosevelt made as early as 11 May 1934. And this was a speech that she made in Washington